Sometimes one completely ordinary moment quietly rewrites the story you thought your heart was destined to tell. Ethan Parker arrived 10 minutes early to his communication studies class every Tuesday. Not because he loved punctuality, but because it gave him a few peaceful minutes before the lecture hall filled with conversations, laughter, and the one distraction he never managed to ignore. Mason Carter usually entered just before class began, carrying a backpack over one shoulder with the effortless confidence of someone who never realized how many people noticed him. As president of the Student Leadership Council, Mason seemed to know everyone on campus. Professors greeted him by name. Athletes waved from the hallway. Students naturally gathered around him after class. Ethan always watched from a comfortable distance, quietly convincing himself that admiring someone from afar was much safer than risking disappointment. He had been doing exactly that since the beginning of sophomore year. Nobody knew. At least, nobody was supposed to. The classroom slowly filled as students claimed their usual seats. Ethan opened his notebook, pretending to review last week's lecture, even though he had already memorized every page. A familiar voice interrupted his thoughts. "Mind if I sit here?" Ethan looked up and nearly forgot how to answer. Mason stood beside the empty seat with an easy smile. "Of course," Ethan replied a little too quickly before clearing his throat. Sure." Mason thanked him and settled into the chair beside him as though it were the most natural decision in the world. Ethan's heart refused to cooperate with the calm expression on his face. He focused on organizing his pens simply to keep his hands busy. A few moments later, Professor Harris walked to the front of the room carrying a stack of folders. "Good morning, everyone," she said cheerfully. "Today we are starting our semester communication project. Instead of traditional presentations, each pair will participate in a couples communication challenge designed to explore empathy, active listening, conflict resolution, and emotional awareness." Curious whispers immediately spread across the classroom. Several students laughed, while others exchanged playful looks with their friends. Professor Harris smiled knowingly. "Relax. Nobody is actually becoming a couple. You are simply role-playing realistic situations to improve communication skills." Ethan finally relaxed, at least until she continued speaking. "I assigned partners randomly before class." She began reading names one by one. Every announcement was followed by cheerful reactions as students found their assigned partners. Ethan barely listened, assuming he would be paired with someone he rarely spoke to. Then Professor Harris looked down at the final page. Ethan Parker with Mason Carter. For one impossible second, the entire room became silent inside Ethan's mind. Then came the laughter, playful applause, and good-natured teasing from classmates who instantly noticed Ethan and Mason sitting side by side. Someone from the back called out, "Looks like destiny did the group project for you." Ethan wished the floor would quietly disappear beneath his chair. Mason simply laughed along with everyone else before turning toward Ethan with a relaxed grin. "I guess we are partners." Ethan forced himself to smile. "Looks that way." Professor Harris handed each pair a folder containing their first assignment. Ethan opened it carefully. Their scenario described two college students planning a future together while balancing classes, work, family expectations, and personal dreams. The instructions encouraged partners to stay in character throughout the semester whenever they practice conversations outside class. "Interesting," Mason said while reading beside him. "This is going to take more than one afternoon." Ethan nodded, hoping his voice would sound normal. "Probably." Mason closed the folder and looked at him with genuine enthusiasm. "There's a coffee shop across the street that stays open late. Want to meet there tomorrow after class and start working on this together?" Ethan stared at him for a heartbeat, wondering if his imagination had finally become stronger than reality. Then he remembered this was only a classroom assignment. Nothing more, nothing less. "Sure," he answered with a quiet smile. "That sounds good." As students packed their bags and streamed into the hallway, Ethan watched Mason hold the classroom door open for everyone before casually waiting so they could leave together. It was a small gesture, one Mason probably offered every day without thinking. Yet as they walked across campus beneath the warm afternoon sun, talking about classes, favorite movies, and terrible cafeteria coffee, Ethan could not shake the strange feeling that the assignment had already begun changing something neither of them completely understood. The easiest roles to play are often the ones that quietly reveal who we have been all along. The next afternoon, Ethan arrived at the little coffee shop across the street from campus, nearly 15 minutes early. He chose a table beside the window where soft autumn sunlight filled the room, then opened the project folder for what was probably the 10th time. He told himself he wanted to prepare for the assignment, but the truth was much simpler. He was nervous, not because of the presentation, but because he would be spending several uninterrupted hours with Mason. When the bell above the entrance chimed, Ethan looked up instinctively. Mason stepped inside wearing a navy hoodie beneath a light denim jacket, smiling the moment he spotted Ethan. "I hope I did not keep you waiting," he said as he placed 2 drinks on the table. Ethan blinked in surprise. "You already ordered?" Mason nodded. "I remembered you picked a vanilla latte after class yesterday, so I guess you might want the same thing." Ethan smiled before he could stop himself. "You remembered that?" Mason shrugged casually. "You only mentioned it once, but it seemed important." Ethan quietly thanked him while wondering why such a small gesture felt unusually meaningful. They spent the next hour reviewing the assignment together. Professor Harris had created several realistic situations requiring them to respond as though they were a long-term couple balancing college, careers, finances, and everyday disagreements. Ethan expected the role play to feel awkward, but something unexpected happened. The conversations flowed naturally. Mason listened carefully before answering every question. He never interrupted. He asked thoughtful follow-up questions, laughed easily whenever Ethan made a joke, and always made sure Ethan finished speaking before offering his own opinion. At one point, Mason smiled and said, "You explain things in a way that makes people feel comfortable." Ethan looked down at his notebook, slightly embarrassed. "Most people say I talk too much when I get excited." Mason shook his head. "I do not think so. I like listening to you." Ethan felt warmth spread across his face and quickly pretended to organize the papers on the table. A few hours passed almost unnoticed. When they finally packed their bags, evening sunlight had begun painting long golden shadows across the sidewalk outside. As they walked back toward campus, Mason slowed his pace to match Ethan's. "Do you usually study alone?" he asked. Ethan nodded. "Most of the time." Mason looked genuinely surprised. "You always seem like someone people would want to spend time with." Ethan laughed softly. "That is kind of you to say." Mason answered with complete sincerity. "I meant it." The following week, their routine became surprisingly consistent. After every communication studies class, they met somewhere different to practice. Sometimes they worked in the library. Other afternoons, they sat beneath large oak trees near the student union. Once they spent nearly 3 hours rehearsing dialogue while sharing sandwiches at a campus picnic table. Without realizing it, they stopped needing the project folder to keep conversations going. They talked about childhood memories, favorite books, family traditions, career goals, and embarrassing first day of college stories. Ethan gradually noticed something else. Mason always saved him the seat beside him before class began. He always waited outside the lecture hall if Ethan packed his backpack more slowly. He always remembered little details that most people forgot. One rainy afternoon, Mason quietly handed Ethan an extra umbrella before they walked across campus together. "You brought 2?" Ethan asked. Mason smiled. "The weather forecast mentioned rain this morning. I thought there was a chance you might forget yours." Ethan looked at him for several silent seconds before accepting it with quiet gratitude. "Thank you." As they continued walking beneath the gentle rain, several classmates passed them on the sidewalk. One of them smiled knowingly and called out, "You two already look like the easiest couple to believe." Ethan nearly stumbled from surprise, but Mason simply laughed and waved before continuing the conversation exactly where they had left off. Ethan glanced at him with growing curiosity. Most people would have corrected the misunderstanding immediately. Mason never did. Instead, he walked beside Ethan beneath the shared umbrella with an easy smile, completely unaware that every thoughtful gesture was making it harder for Ethan to remember where the classroom assignment ended and where real life quietly began. Sometimes the hardest part of pretending is realizing that your heart quietly stopped pretending long before you did. By the third week of the couple's communication challenge, the project had become part of Ethan's everyday routine. Every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, he and Mason automatically walked out of Professor Harris's classroom together without discussing where they would study. It simply happened. Sometimes they chose the library, where whispered conversations blended with the soft turning of pages. Other days, they settled beneath the large maple trees outside the student union, enjoying warm autumn afternoons while reviewing their role-play scenarios. The assignments gradually became more personal. Instead of discussing imaginary disagreements, Professor Harris encouraged each pair to practice active listening by sharing real experiences and responding as supportive partners would. Ethan found himself telling Mason stories he had never shared with anyone on campus. He spoke about how difficult it had been moving away from home for college, how he often questioned whether he fit in, and how he sometimes preferred sitting quietly with a book instead of joining large social events. Mason never rushed to fill the silence after Ethan spoke. He simply listened with complete attention before saying, "Thank you for trusting me with that." Ethan realized no one had ever thanked him for being honest before. During one practice session, Professor Harris walked between the groups, quietly observing each conversation. When she reached Ethan and Mason, she smiled warmly. "Your communication feels remarkably natural," she commented. "You two have stopped performing. You are simply listening to one another." Ethan laughed nervously while Mason smiled with quiet satisfaction. "I guess we have had a lot of practice," Mason replied. Professor Harris nodded. "The best communication rarely sounds rehearsed." Her words lingered in Ethan's mind long after class ended. Later that afternoon, Mason suggested they take a break from studying and walk across campus before heading home. Fallen leaves covered the sidewalks in shades of gold, orange, and deep red, while students gathered on the lawn enjoying the unusually warm weather. They stopped beside a small campus fountain where several ducks drifted peacefully across the water. Ethan leaned against the stone edge and smiled. "This might be my favorite place on campus." Mason looked around before answering. "Mine too." Ethan laughed softly. "Really?" Mason nodded. "It became my favorite after we started meeting here." Ethan looked away quickly, hoping Mason would not notice the smile he could no longer hide. As they continued walking, Mason's phone buzzed with several incoming messages. He glanced at the screen before placing the phone back into his pocket without replying. "You're not going to answer those?" Ethan asked. Mason shook his head. "They can wait." Ethan looked surprised. "What if they are important?" Mason smiled. "Right now, I would rather finish this conversation." Ethan felt his heart beat just a little faster. No classroom assignment had instructed Mason to ignore his responsibilities just to keep talking with him. That choice felt entirely genuine. The following morning, Ethan arrived at class carrying a cup of coffee he had picked up on the way across campus. Before he reached his usual seat, he noticed another cup already waiting on his desk with a handwritten note resting beside it. The note simply read, "Thought you might need something warm after walking across campus this morning. Have a great day." Ethan immediately looked around the classroom. Mason smiled from across the room and gave him a small wave before returning to his conversation with another student. Ethan carefully picked up the cup, unable to stop smiling. Throughout the lecture, he caught himself glancing toward Mason more often than he intended. Every time their eyes met, Mason smiled naturally, as though those quiet moments had become completely normal. After class ended, they walked toward the student parking lot together. As they reached the crosswalk, Mason instinctively stepped to the side closest to the street while they waited for the light to change. Ethan noticed the small gesture immediately. It was thoughtful, protective, and completely unconscious. "You do that every time," Ethan said. Mason looked confused. "Do what?" Ethan smiled. "You always walk on the outside." Mason blinked for a moment before looking down at the sidewalk. "I never realized." Ethan quietly wondered how many other things Mason did without thinking. Small acts of care had slowly become habits, and none of them appeared to belong to the assignment anymore. As they crossed the street together beneath the late afternoon sun, Ethan found himself asking the one question he had tried to avoid for weeks. If all of this was only acting, why did it feel so completely real? Edit: the smallest moments often reveal the biggest truths, especially when neither heart realizes it is slowly falling in love. By the middle of October, the Couples Communication Challenge had become one of the most talked about projects on campus. Every Tuesday, Professor Harris introduced new scenarios, and every Thursday, each pair performed portions of their conversations in front of the class. What surprised Ethan most was how naturally he and Mason worked together. They no longer needed to rehearse every sentence because they had learned how to listen before speaking. Their conversations felt effortless, filled with quiet understanding rather than carefully memorized dialogue. During one class exercise, Professor Harris asked every pair to imagine they had experienced a stressful week and could only solve the problem through honest communication. Mason looked at Ethan with the same gentle smile he always wore before beginning a role play. "Long day?" he asked warmly. Ethan answered with a small laugh. "You could say that." Mason leaned forward just enough to show complete attention. "Tell me everything. I am listening." Ethan suddenly forgot they were acting. He spoke about upcoming exams, a research paper that refused to come together, and his growing fear that he was never quite good enough compared to everyone else. Mason never interrupted. The moments we fear the most are often the ones that quietly reveal what has already become true. By the end of October, the Couples Communication Challenge had finally reached its conclusion. Professor Harris smiled proudly as the final presentations came to an end, thanking every student for approaching the project with honesty and empathy. "Communication is not about saying perfect words," she reminded the class. "It is about making another person feel understood." Ethan glanced toward Mason, remembering every conversation they had shared during the past several weeks. Somehow those words described their experience better than any grade ever could. After the last pair finished presenting, Professor Harris closed her folder and smiled warmly. "Congratulations, everyone. The project officially ends today." Applause filled the classroom as students celebrated the completion of one of the semester's longest assignments. Partners exchanged high fives, laughed about awkward role-play moments, and immediately returned to their usual friend groups. Ethan quietly packed his notebook into his backpack, while telling himself this was exactly how things were supposed to happen. The assignment had ended. Their reason for spending so much time together had ended with it. He expected Mason to thank him for being a great partner before naturally returning to his busy life on campus. Instead, Mason walked over carrying both of their backpacks. "Ready?" he asked with the same relaxed smile he wore every afternoon. Ethan blinked. "Ready for what?" "Lunch," Mason answered as though the question surprised him. "You said last week you wanted to try the new sandwich place near the bookstore." Ethan hesitated. "But the project is over." Mason looked briefly confused before smiling again. "I know." Ethan waited for more explanation, but none came. They left the classroom together exactly as they always had. Mason held the door open, matched Ethan's walking pace across campus, and asked about an upcoming history exam as though nothing had changed. During lunch, they laughed over a menu item that turned out to be much larger than either of them expected, shared fries without thinking about it, and spent nearly an hour talking about favorite childhood Halloween memories. Not once did Mason mention that the role-play assignment had ended. Over the next several days, the pattern continued. Every morning, Ethan found a cup of coffee waiting on his desk before class. Every afternoon, Mason saved a seat beside him in the student lounge. When Ethan stayed late at the library studying for midterms, Mason appeared carrying 2 hot chocolates and quietly sat across from him with his own textbooks. One evening, after they finished studying, Mason walked Ethan back to his apartment building just as he had done several times before. They reached the entrance, and Ethan automatically smiled. "Thank you for walking me home." Mason laughed softly. "I always do." Ethan looked at him carefully. "You really do." Mason simply wished him good night before heading toward his own residence hall without seeming to realize how naturally those words had come. The following Tuesday, Ethan entered communication studies expecting everything to feel different. Instead, Mason was already sitting in their usual seats. He looked up immediately and smiled. "Good morning. I picked up your favorite vanilla latte." Ethan accepted the cup with quiet gratitude, but confusion continued growing inside him. During class, there were no more partner exercises. Students worked individually on new assignments. Still, whenever Professor Harris asked a question, Mason instinctively turned toward Ethan first, sharing the same quick smile they had exchanged throughout the entire project. After class, one of Ethan's classmates caught up with him outside the building. "I thought the assignment ended last week," she said with a curious grin. Ethan nodded. "It did." She glanced toward Mason, who was waiting patiently a few feet away while checking his phone. "Then why does he still wait for you every single day?" Ethan looked toward Mason, who immediately slipped his phone into his pocket the moment their eyes met. "Ready to go?" Mason asked naturally. Ethan smiled, then looked back at his classmate without knowing how to answer. As they walked across campus beneath brilliant autumn leaves, Ethan realized something that both comforted and frightened him at the same time. The project had officially ended days ago. Yet nothing about the way Mason treated him had changed. Every conversation, every thoughtful gesture, every shared meal, every quiet walk across campus continued exactly as before, leaving Ethan with one impossible question that echoed through his heart. If they were no longer pretending to be close, why did Mason still act as though they had never stopped being together? The truth has a quiet way of revealing itself when pretending is no longer enough to explain what the heart keeps choosing. Nearly 2 weeks had passed since the couple's communication challenge officially ended, yet Ethan and Mason continued, spending almost every day together. They met before class, studied in the library, shared lunches between lectures, and walked across campus each evening as though none of it had ever depended on a classroom assignment. At first, Ethan convinced himself not to overthink it. Mason was simply kind. Mason treated everyone well. But every passing day made that explanation harder to believe. Mason did not bring coffee for everyone. He did not wait outside every classroom for everyone. He did not remember everyone's favorite snacks or text everyone before an exam, wishing them good luck. One chilly November afternoon, Ethan sat alone beneath the large maple tree near the student union while reviewing notes for an upcoming history test. A familiar shadow stopped beside the bench. Mason smiled as he held out a warm paper bag. "I remembered you skipped lunch because you wanted to finish studying," he said. "So I picked up your favorite turkey sandwich." Ethan accepted it with a grateful smile, but instead of opening the bag, he quietly looked at Mason. "Can I ask you something?" Mason nodded immediately. "Anything." Ethan took a slow breath. "Why are you still doing all of this?" Mason looked slightly confused. "Doing what?" Ethan laughed softly, though there was uncertainty behind it. "Walking me to class, bringing me coffee, saving me a seat, waiting for me after lectures, spending every afternoon together." Mason answered without hesitation. "Because I enjoy it." Ethan lowered his eyes, but the project ended. For the first time since they had met, Mason remained completely silent. The sounds of students talking nearby seemed to fade into the background. Ethan finally looked back up. Mason's expression held genuine surprise, almost as though he had forgotten something important. "The project," Mason repeated quietly. "Right." Ethan forced a small smile. "You do remember it was only roleplay, do not you?" Mason blinked several times before letting out a quiet breath. Then, to Ethan's complete surprise, he laughed at himself. It was not mocking laughter. It sounded more like someone suddenly realizing an obvious truth. Ethan looked at him with growing confusion. "What is funny?" Mason shook his head slowly. "I honestly forgot." Ethan stared at him. "Forgot what?" Mason met his eyes with complete sincerity. "I forgot we were supposed to be pretending." Ethan felt his heart stop for just a moment. Neither of them spoke. The autumn breeze carried a few golden leaves across the sidewalk while students continued passing by without noticing the life-changing conversation happening beneath the maple tree. Mason sat beside Ethan on the bench, his voice calm but unmistakably honest. Somewhere between the library study sessions, the coffee shop conversations, and walking you home every evening, it stopped feeling like an assignment. He smiled sheepishly. I never consciously decided to keep acting. I simply started treating you the way I wanted to. Ethan struggled to find words. You mean? Mason nodded gently. Every coffee after the project ended was real. Every message, every walk across campus, every excuse to spend another hour with you. Ethan looked down at his hands, trying to process everything he had just heard. For weeks, he had convinced himself he was the only one becoming emotionally attached. Now the entire situation suddenly looked different. Mason leaned back against the bench and smiled with quiet honesty. I think the assignment gave me permission to spend time with someone I already wanted to know better. When it ended, I never saw a reason to stop. Ethan slowly turned toward him. You wanted to know me before Professor Harris paired us together? Mason laughed softly. Ethan, I volunteered to help with freshman orientation last semester because someone told me you were one of the student mentors. I just never found the courage to start a real conversation. Ethan's eyes widened with disbelief. You were kidding. Mason shook his head. Not even a little. Ethan could not stop smiling anymore. Months of uncertainty, self-doubt, and quiet hope suddenly began fitting together like pieces of a puzzle he never realized both of them had been solving. As the late afternoon sun settled across the campus, neither of them hurried to leave the bench. For the first time, there were no scripts, no classroom exercises, and no imaginary relationship to perform. There were only two students sitting beneath falling autumn leaves, quietly realizing that the story they thought had begun as make-believe had already become the most genuine part of both their lives. Sometimes the greatest confession is not saying the words first. Is staying when every fear tells you to walk away. Ethan sat quietly beneath the maple tree long after their conversation had ended. Neither of them seemed eager to leave, as though both understood that something important had shifted between them. The late afternoon sun cast long golden shadows across the campus lawn while students hurried past on their way to evening classes. For the first time since they had been paired together, there was no assignment waiting to guide the conversation. No roleplay scenarios. No imaginary relationship. Only two people trying to understand what had quietly grown between them. Ethan finally smiled, still shaking his head in disbelief. So you really forgot we were supposed to stop pretending? Mason laughed softly. I wish I could say it happened all at once, but it did not. Every day we spent together felt natural. Eventually, I stopped separating the project from real life. Ethan looked down at the paper coffee cup resting between his hands. I kept telling myself not to read too much into every little thing you did. Mason turned toward him with genuine curiosity. Like what? Ethan laughed nervously. The coffee every morning, waiting outside my classes, walking me home, remembering things I only mentioned once. Mason smiled with quiet warmth. Those never felt little to me. The honesty in his voice made Ethan's heart race all over again. They slowly stood and began walking across campus together, following the familiar brick pathway toward the library. Students passed them carrying backpacks, chatting about weekend plans, while colorful autumn leaves drifted gently through the cool afternoon air. Everything looked exactly the same as it had a week earlier, yet Ethan felt as though the entire campus had somehow changed. After a few minutes of comfortable silence, Mason spoke again. Can I tell you something else? Ethan nodded. Of course. Mason smiled thoughtfully. Do you remember the first day Professor Harris announced the project? Ethan laughed. I remember wanting to disappear when everyone started teasing us. Mason grinned. I remember thinking I was the luckiest person in the room. Ethan stopped walking. What? Mason rubbed the back of his neck with a slightly embarrassed smile. I had noticed you months before that class. You always arrived early. You always thanked the professors before leaving. You held doors for people even when they never noticed. Ethan stared at him in complete surprise. Mason continued quietly. I kept trying to think of a reason to talk to you, but every idea sounded awkward. Then Professor Harris paired us together, and suddenly I had the perfect excuse. Ethan felt his eyes becoming warm. I thought I was the only one secretly hoping for impossible things. Mason shook his head. Apparently, we were both hoping. They reached the library steps, but neither of them went inside. Instead, they sat on a nearby bench overlooking the campus quad where students played frisbee beneath brilliant orange trees. Ethan looked toward the open lawn before speaking almost in a whisper. "There is something I should probably admit to." Mason waited patiently. "I had a crush on you long before we ever worked together." Mason smiled so brightly that Ethan could not help smiling back. "Really?" Ethan laughed. "I thought everyone knew you. I never imagined someone like you would even notice someone like me." Mason answered immediately. "Ethan, I noticed you because you were different from everyone else. You listened before speaking. You made people feel comfortable. You never tried to impress anyone." Ethan quietly looked away. "I always thought those things made me ordinary." Mason gently shook his head. "Those are exactly the things that made you unforgettable." Ethan felt months of quiet insecurity slowly beginning to disappear. For so long he had assumed his feelings were one-sided, something he simply needed to keep hidden. Now he realized they had both spent the semester carrying the same hope while waiting for the other person to speak first. As evenings settled across campus, the lights outside the student center gradually flickered on. Mason stood and looked toward Ethan with a gentle smile. "There is one thing I would like to change." Ethan looked up curiously. "What is that?" Mason extended his hand with calm confidence. "I do not want you to be my project partner anymore." Ethan blinked in confusion until Mason continued with a quiet laugh. "I would rather be the person who gets to take you on a real date this Saturday, if that is something you would like too." Ethan looked at the offered hand, then back into Mason's hopeful eyes. The assignment that had brought them together was finally behind them, but for the first time, the future waiting ahead no longer felt like something they had to imagine. It felt like something they could choose together. The most beautiful love stories begin the moment two people stop wondering what might happen and decide to discover it together. Ethan looked at Mason's outstretched hand for only a second before a quiet smile spread across his face. "I would like that," he answered softly. Mason's smile grew even brighter, the kind that reached his eyes without effort. Instead of celebrating with dramatic words, he simply laughed with obvious relief. "Good," he said. "I was hoping you would." They walked across campus side by side as the evening lights reflected against colorful autumn leaves scattered along the sidewalks. Nothing about the university looked different, yet everything somehow felt new. The following Saturday afternoon arrived beneath clear blue skies and crisp fall air. Mason suggested visiting the local botanical gardens just outside town, a place filled with winding walking paths, peaceful ponds, and rows of brilliant seasonal flowers. "I figured it would be quieter than downtown," Mason explained as they entered through the front gate. Ethan smiled. "You remembered I like places where conversations are easier." Mason looked at him with playful confidence. "I pay attention." They spent hours wandering through gardens filled with red maple trees, golden chrysanthemums, and peaceful stone pathways. They talked about childhood dreams, favorite holiday traditions, and the future they each imagined after graduation. For the first time, neither of them hid behind imaginary roles or classroom exercises. Every question came from genuine curiosity. Every answer carried quiet honesty. As they crossed a small wooden bridge overlooking a calm pond, Ethan paused to watch several ducks glide across the water. "Do you know something strange?" he asked. Mason turned toward him. "What is that?" Ethan smiled thoughtfully. "The project was supposed to teach communication skills. I think it accidentally taught me how to stop hiding." Mason nodded gently. "It did the same for me." Ethan looked surprised. "Really?" Mason rested his hands on the wooden railing before answering. "People expect me to be confident all the time. They assume I always know exactly what to say. But around you, I stopped worrying about saying the perfect thing. I just wanted to be honest." Ethan quietly looked out across the water, letting those words settle inside him. Later that afternoon, they stopped at a small cafe overlooking the gardens. While waiting for dessert, Mason reached into his backpack and carefully removed something wrapped inside a folded napkin. Ethan looked curious. "What is that?" Mason unfolded the napkin to reveal the small printed photograph from the fall festival, the one the student volunteer had taken beneath the glowing lanterns weeks earlier. "You kept it," Ethan said with quiet surprise. Mason smiled. Of course I did. Ethan studied the picture. They were standing close together, smiling naturally without realizing how comfortable they already looked beside one another. I remember waiting for you to tell her we were not really together, Ethan admitted. Mason laughed softly. The funny part is that I never wanted to. Ethan looked back at the photograph before smiling. Neither did I. As the afternoon faded into evening, they returned to campus where students gathered outside the student center, enjoying the mild weather. Several classmates noticed them walking together and smiled knowingly. One friend waved before calling out, "So, was everyone right all along?" Mason glanced toward Ethan, giving him every opportunity to answer first. Ethan looked at Mason, then back toward their friends with a smile that felt lighter than any he had worn before. "Actually," he said calmly, "we finally stopped pretending." Their classmates laughed, cheered, and offered warm congratulations before continuing across the quad. Ethan expected to feel embarrassed standing in the middle of campus with everyone suddenly knowing the truth. Instead, he felt completely at peace. There was no longer anything to hide. As the sun slowly disappeared beyond the university buildings, Mason and Ethan found themselves sitting on the same bench beneath the large maple tree where everything had changed only days earlier. Mason gently reached for Ethan's hand, not because the assignment required it, not because anyone was watching, but simply because it felt natural. Ethan smiled as their hands rested comfortably together. The role-play had ended weeks ago, yet the most meaningful conversation of their lives had only just begun, and for the first time, neither of them needed a script to know exactly where they wanted the story to go next. I stood on the porch long after the laughter inside had softened into the quiet rhythm of an ordinary evening. Years ago, I believed peace was something fragile, something that could disappear the moment I reached for it. I understand now that peace is built one choice at a time. It grows every morning we choose honesty over fear, patience over anger, and hope over regret. The home behind me was never the one I imagined when I was younger. It was better because every wall, every photograph, and every memory had been earned instead of imagined. The warm glow from the living room spilled across the front steps as the children argued playfully over a board game, their voices carrying through the open window with the effortless joy only children possess. My mate stepped outside a moment later without saying a word. He simply stood beside me, our shoulders brushing together as we watched the stars slowly emerge above the quiet neighborhood. Once, silence between us had been filled with misunderstanding. Now it carried trust. Neither of us needed to explain what the other already understood. He reached for my hand with the same quiet certainty he had learned through years of rebuilding what had once been broken. There was no dramatic promise left to make, because we had already proven every promise through the lives we lived together. The road behind us had been filled with mistakes, fear, and impossible decisions. There had been moments when walking away would have been easier than staying. There had been days when forgiveness felt heavier than resentment. Yet every difficult,